Hello, and welcome back to Human Evolution. Today we want to talk about the selective pressures. These are the things that are going to cause certain traits to be successful or not successful, to be detrimental, not detrimental, right? So what are we talking about when we talk about the pressures that influence survival? We can really divide that up into two sections. The environment and all the stuff that comes with that, like how do you get water, how do you get food, how do you get shelter, the actual conditions of the environment. What is the geography like? Is it really rocky? Is it sandy? What about the weather and then the overall climate? What is that like? Then you can say, well, interacting with other species, right? Now, we've talked a lot about the environment and how that applies pressures. I mean, we think about if it's really cold, you probably are going to see organisms that have cold adapted traits because organisms that didn't died out, right? So we kind of get that. Today, I want to focus on this other side, interacting with other species. So really, there's four big areas that we want to talk about. That's predation, competition, mutualism, and symbiosis. And we'll have a little crossover between those last two. Predation is about getting food and not being food, right? Competition is about doing all this stuff that we've been talking about better than any other individual or any other species. Mutualism is about working with other species beneficially so everybody gets something out of it. And symbiosis is about organism species that really live off of each other together, right? And so we'll talk about that later on. When we talk about these relationships that shape both species, we are talking about coevolution. So when we kind of identify these interactions, and competition is not on here, but competition has a direct effect on both species, but it's a little more complicated, so we'll actually start out with that. But when we start looking at these, oh no, I do have it on there. Interspecific competition is going to have negative effects actually on both species. That's the first thing we'll talk about, and this is really all about I survive better than you, right? Predation, obviously the species that is the eater is going to benefit. The species that is the eatee, the prey, is going to not benefit, right? So there's benefit for one, detriment to the other. Then you have your three types of symbiosis, which are parasitism, one benefits, one is harmed. Mutualism, everybody benefits. And you have other mutualistic relationships too, we'll talk about that later. And then commensalism, where you have one benefits and one is unaffected. Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time on commensalism because that's not a thing that we think is very common actually in nature. So we're going to focus on mutualism and parasitism when we talk about symbiosis, but we'll get there. All right, so what exactly is coevolution? This is two species evolving in response to each other. There are two or more species interacting, they're exerting pressures on each other, and a community is a group of populations that are all interacting with each other. A community plus the abiotic factors, the terrain, the weather, the water, that's an ecosystem, okay? So just to give you two terms, community and ecosystem. But basically, it's a response when you're talking about coevolution. So coevolution, though, is not when you have some species just doing what they're doing and another species evolves in response to that, right? So that is not it. That's just natural selection. Coevolution in particular, both species have to be changing. Now, these interactions can be divided into antagonistic reactions and mutualistic reactions. You kind of saw that on the other slide, but I want to put it specifically here and add a couple others. Competition obviously is antagonistic. Predator and parasite to prey is antagonistic. But let's not forget about our plant predators, so plant and herbivore, and then also we've got all these pathogens. Think about things that make other organisms sick. That is antagonistic as well, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Not today, though, a little bit later on. All right, mutualism. So mutualistic relationships that are not symbiotic would be your plant pollinators and then your beneficial microbes and fungi that help plants assimilate nutrients. All right, so let's start with competition. Ultimately, only one species can ever fill a niche. Otherwise, there is competition because there's limited resources. So how do we alleviate competition? Oftentimes, it's going to be through specialization. There are three sort of outcomes. One, you have out competition. One species or one individual wins the competition, right? Now, in some cases, you've got some changes that will occur. Species can exploit the same food source in a different way, or they can adapt to a new resource because of that individual variation among offspring, opening up new doors, right, for all practical purposes. So we'll come back to this later on too. Okay, so first let's talk about the niche. The niche of any organism is its use of biotic and abiotic resources. Okay, so it's kind of the role it plays in the ecosystem. It's all of the things that it exploits. It's all of the interactions that it has. And you have an ideal set of resources, and then you have the actual set of resources. And the actual amount of resources are going to limit population sizes. This is called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the number of individuals that can exist in an ecosystem in any population because of limited resources. But this is the niche. And it turns out that when you're talking about a species holding a niche, then you're talking about competing between different species, right? When you're talking about the organism's niche, each organism is trying to get as many resources as it needs in order to survive. So we're going to start there with intraspecific competition. And this is where we have a species fighting other individuals, right? So within a population. So which of the following would be an effective strategy for reducing competition among individuals within a population? Right? Different ecological niches for juveniles and adults, eating prey before they're ripe for another species, rapid reproduction, establishing territories, or none of these. Well, rapid reproduction right off the bat is a bad idea. That increases competition because you have more individuals. Eating prey before they are, quote, ripe for another species, well, that's about another species, so that's interspecific competition. But establishing territories actually there's a lot of competition for territories, but once you have the territories established, you can minimize a little bit of that competition. There's still competition, but it relieves some of it, right? The best strategy for reducing intraspecific competition is, of course, having a completely different ecological niche for juveniles and adults. An example of this would be frogs, right? Tadpoles live in the water, they eat water stuff. Frogs live on the shoreline, they eat shore stuff, right? And so there's no competition between them at all. So this is the best way to reduce intraspecific competition. Now, I will say that I will actually expect you to have different ecological niches and establishing territories for reducing intraspecific competition in your mini quiz, for instance. But if you only had to pick one, and you don't, but if there came a time when you only had to pick one, it would be the different ecological niches, because that actually doesn't just reduce competition, it eliminates it between the juveniles and adults. Now, there's still the juveniles are competing and the adults are competing, but they're not competing with each other, like across juveniles versus adults. Okay. So what are the big things that you see in intraspecific competition? That would be aggression, right? Aggression helps secure resources. It's a big deal. Aggression helps set up dominance hierarchies, and so you can alleviate some of that aggression by setting up the hierarchy, but every time the hierarchy changes, you will have more aggressive behavior. And of course, it requires aggression to defend territories. Once you get a territory, you can actually defend it. And you can see that there's lots of posturing, there's lots of adaptive traits, physical traits that go to show, I'm more aggressive, I'm a better competitor, whether it is claws or teeth or slamming into each other with big horns. You'll see lots and lots of posturing. Now, in reality, in intraspecific competition, you really don't want to get into a physical contact or a physical conflict with the other individual, because you could actually get hurt when you make contact. And so physically fighting is the last resort. Most of it is about posturing and showing what you are capable of, as opposed to actually physically engaging. Okay, so let's switch to interspecific competition. This is where you are fighting with other species. Two species using the same resources, but the problem with this, as seen in the lion and hyena picture here is that no two organisms occupy the same niche, and so this causes a lot of stress, a lot of conflict, a lot of competition. Okay, so here's your first question on this. Certain night-active moths and day-active birds are specialized nectar feeders. How do these species coexist if they're using the same resource for food? Well, there is lots of conflict between lions and hyenas. They fight and kill each other all the time over the same prey, right? So what is happening in the moth-bird situation? It's okay because there's enough nectar to supply both the birds and the moths. Eventually, the niche breadth will increase because they'll start eating other things and that'll minimize competition. Both will migrate to a new area since they both eat nectar, right? And they'll both look for new sources, or they don't compete since they feed at different times. This goes to the idea of how do we exploit the same food source and not compete. We do not have competition in this particular situation because they feed at different times. This is resource partitioning. Over time, right, moths have become active at night and birds have become active at day. So even though they are both having nectar, and they may even be getting nectar from the same plants, they're not doing it at the same time, so they are not in direct competition. And this problem has been solved by the idea of the principal competitive exclusion. When two species try to occupy the same niche, one species outcompetes the other, right? And so you have a situation where specialization tends to occur, and so some niches will become narrower because of competitive exclusion, and some niches will just start to separate, right, because of specialization. So in this case, right, species A, so let's say that you have two nectar-feeding birds, right? Species A may have a bigger niche, and species E here does not, right? Species A might be a bird that eats nectar and pollen and maybe an insect or two, okay? So they are generalists. They are not as good at getting nectar and all of these other things, but they can get a lot of stuff, right? Species E may be a hummingbird who is highly specialized and only eats nectar, but is the best nectar getter in all of the ecosystem, right? And so specialization there. And here's an example of how competition actually works in the real world. I like to call it the War of the Squirrels. This is our adorable gray squirrel, right? Cute, fluffy. We think of them as just being, oh, that's nice. They are, in fact, super competitors. The gray squirrel is American and was introduced into England before World War II, actually, as an exotic pet. And they escaped into the wild. And when they escaped into the wild, they encountered their red squirrel cousin, who is the slow, gentle, nut-eating squirrel of the rodent world. Our squirrel, on the other hand, is fast, is aggressive, eats protein, so it has a higher energy diet, and they will eat almost everything, actually. So the gray squirrel is a master competitor. They're generalists, they're really aggressive, and that has not gone well for the red squirrel, who is probably going to go extinct over time because of competition with the gray squirrel. This also highlights, by the way, a human influence. We brought gray squirrels into England where red squirrels had evolved to just be doing red squirrel stuff. Gray squirrels evolved under different pressures, and so they are a different kind of animal, but those pressures have made them like the Ferrari of the squirrel world, and the red squirrel is the Model T of the squirrel world. And obviously you're going to have conflict there, but that conflict won't last long because of the principle of competitive exclusion. Gray squirrels will win. All right, let's shift to predation. Predation, we're talking about an evolutionary arms race, right? You constantly have predators trying to catch prey and prey trying to avoid getting eaten. And as a matter of fact, in this picture, I would like you, based on their physical characteristics, to identify the predator. Is it the cobra, the mongoose, both, or neither? Well, in this case, it is in fact the mongoose. The mongoose is an expert cobra hunter, and that snake is really intimidating and an excellent predator on its own, but it's not a predator of mongoose. It's a predator of other little mammals. The mongoose, on the other hand, eats cobra. So, what kinds of advantages, adaptations, does the mongoose have to prevent the cobra from actually hurting it while it's trying to eat it? Well, it's got little teeth and it's got little claws and it's super fast. So, now I want to talk a little bit about a couple, I just want to give you some examples of the structural adaptations that have occurred over time, just to show you the wide variety of predator-prey stuff that you've got. And I'm also going to talk about chemical adaptations and some behavioral adaptations as well. Now, the obvious thing are natural weapons, right? Claws, beaks, right? Also horns. So it depends on if you're a predator or a prey, you'll have different strategies. Being flexible, right? Snakes are so flexible they can crush their prey there. The octopus is flexible. It can hide under rocks from predators. It can also hide so it can attack prey, so it hides as a predator. Now, sometimes you would like to be sneaky, right? You can look like some other thing, maybe a food source or a female. In this case, this is actually a female Photurus firefly. She has captured a male Photinus firefly because she mimics with her light the female Photinus. So that little male thinking he's going to come meet a girlfriend, and in fact, he just gets eaten. Very sad. This would be a predator kind of advantage. If you want a prey advantage, you might want to be protected by armor. You'd like to have plates, shells. This is a prey strategy. Okay. Along those lines, maybe some of those shells and armor become spines. You want to be pokey, and sometimes your spines have poisons and stuff in them. That's exciting. Now, if you are prey, you might also want to have the parts of you that predators can grab break off, right? Breakaway parts. Now, if you're a predator, being large enough to eat everything is super helpful. By the same token, being large enough not to get eaten is also super helpful. And if you don't start out large enough, maybe you can get large enough, and if you can have spines too, that'd be great, right? But being bigger than you are could scare off a predator. What about hiding, right? Camouflage. This is one of the greatest strategies that all animals have, right? In here, you have a little bunny right there. Now, the problem with coloration, though, especially cryptic coloration, is that as soon as you move, you can be seen. As long as you're still, you blend in, but otherwise you're going to be seen. And I'd like to point out that cryptic coloration, while most of the time it's dull and drab to match the environment, doesn't have to be. Just because you're brightly colored doesn't mean you don't fit into your ecosystem blended in. Tigers, that orange and black seems like it would be really obvious, but in the forest it turns out it isn't. All right, now, what if your environment changes and you need to be camouflaged all the time? Sometimes you can just change your coat when you change the seasons. Sometimes you might want to be camouflaged as something that is inanimate, right? A stick or a leaf. I challenge you to find the moth in this picture. Now, sometimes you want the opposite. Sometimes you want to advertise that eating you is a bad idea because you have a chemical adaptation. In this case, your coloration is called aposematic, and it is warning coloration, and it says, I might have a noxious smell or a taste. Bitter, right? Ooh. Also, you could smell like death. You don't want to eat dead stuff because there's all kinds of pathogens that might be growing in it, so that's a bad idea. This is a prey strategy, by the way. Aposematic coloration was a prey strategy. You may also want to have some sort of spray that you could shoot in the face of a predator that would be gross or painful. The bombardier beetle, it's painful. The skunk, obviously, we know is very stinky. Right? You could also be toxic. That's where that coloration comes in. This is your friend poison ivy, and by your friend, I mean not your friend at all. This is a prey strategy, right? On the other hand, you might want to incapacitate your prey with a poison. That would be a predator strategy. If you are not poisonous, you don't produce something, you might want to look like somebody who does, right? So here you have the very poisonous coral snake and the not poisonous milk snake, the very stingy bee, and the not stingy at all robber fly. And then here you have the bitter, yucky monarch with its delicious, delicious mimic, the viceroy. All right, this is a prey strategy too, by the way. Now let's talk about some behavioral strategies. Here we've got the speed and agility, right? Be fast enough to catch everything. A praying mantis is so fast, we actually have to use slow motion cameras to see it strike. The cheetah is the fastest land animal on the planet. It is only slightly faster than the gazelle, which is the second fastest land animal and also one of the most agile. The fastest cheetahs catch gazelles. The fastest, most agile gazelles escape cheetahs. And you can see over time how they have shaped each other, becoming the fastest and second fastest animals, right? Okay, slow could also be helpful. Maybe you're so slow you just never get noticed. That would be a prey thing, by the way. Probably predators want to be faster. So you see all of these specialized traits. Is this a guarantee for success? I mean, look at those teeth. Those are specialized meat-tearing teeth. Having said that, though, what if you get so specialized that you, in this case, can't even handle, right, your specialized trait? This is the saber-toothed cat. Their teeth get too big for them to actually be able to hunt effectively. They start breaking off. It's all bad. But also, what if the environment changes, right? What if you're super, super slow and you can hide in the trees and all the trees die? Specialization is not a guarantee of success, and in some cases, it actually guarantees failure in a changing environment. So specialization is great and could be dangerous. It's a high risk gamble. Okay, so false. It does not guarantee success. All right, let's shift to symbiosis. What is this? When two organisms live together in a way that's going to benefit at least one of them. It can occur in all kingdoms. It can occur with organisms from different kingdoms. And there's three main types. We already talked about them a little bit. Mutualism, yay everybody. Commensalism, yay. The other one doesn't care. Parasitism, yay. Ooh, bad for one of them. So we're going to start with parasites. This is just where you have some animal literally living off of another organism, okay? Ticks are a really good example of that. Mutualism is win-win. You have two species that can interact in ways that benefit them both. These ants and aphids, for instance, the ants protect the aphids, take care of them. The aphid poop feeds the ants, right? In this case, you have a fungus that is growing on the roots of the grass here, and it allows the grass to take in more nutrients. And so this symbiotic mutualistic relationship makes the grass grow better. Okay. Now, evidence shows that some grasses actually benefit from being grazed. Which of the following terms would best describe this plant-herbivore interaction? Is it predation, mutualism, parasitism, competition, or commensalism? It is really tempting to say predation here, and plants getting eaten by herbivores is predation. Having said that, though, this particular relationship is mutualism because the grass benefits from having some of it trimmed away by predators. It grows faster. So this one is actually mutualism. And this goes to the point that mutualism is not always symbiotic. Plant pollinators are a really good example of a non-symbiotic mutualistic relationship, which brings me to the idea about plants. What advantages do you actually have if you cannot go anywhere, right? Plants have huge problems. They can't move, so they can't escape any of their environmental pressures. They can't escape predators. They can't interact with their mates, they can't follow their nutrients, and they have to avoid competition with offspring that often fall right next to them. So they have to adapt to a wide variety of challenges. So how do they do that? Here are some strategies for plants, just to give you another look at some of the great things that have evolved over time. Okay, so how do they access resources? Their root systems actually are different depending on where they live, right? So if you have shallow water, shallow nutrients, you may have shallow branching roots. If you have deep, limited nutrients in the soil, you may have one giant, long, deep taproot, okay? You may have to get a mutualistic, a symbiotic relationship, right? Where you have bacteria or fungi living in your roots to help you assimilate. What about reproducing? Plants have like the most specific long distance relationships, right? They have to spread pollen from plant to plant. That is a distance. How do they do it? Wind, number one, and pollinators, number two. We usually think of butterflies, bees, wasps, things like that as pollinators, but don't forget, animals and birds can join into that too. And seeds can get dispersed through fruits, right, and nuts. Some seeds will actually attach onto mammal fur, so the mammals will go and roll someplace else to get it off. But more often than not, what you see are fruits and berries. You eat the fruit or berry, and you poop out out the seeds later. That works out really well because it's at a distance from the parent, and if it's poop, then you get nutrients for the new plants in the nitrates in the fertilizer that you've added. Now, what about getting eaten? Oh my gosh, no place to go. So they have physical structures like spines as well, right? Spines poke you in the mouth, and they may actually contain a secondary metabolite, which would be that chemical adaptation where you could have repellents, they could be bitter, they could be hard to eat, right? Like the silica in grass, or they could just be downright toxic, like this beautiful foxglove that will stop your heart. This is mint, by the way, and rosemary and lemon. These are actually all either repellents or unpalatable to many herbivores. You could also have symbiotic relationships with mostly ants. This is ant and an acacia. They actually live in the spines, and anytime somebody comes to try and eat the acacia leaves, they will swarm out and attack the herbivore. Now, what about your environment? Here are some ways. Precipitation, lots of snow, lots of rain can cause problems with plants. Lots of rain can cause the leaves to rot. If the water sits on the leaves, can also cause root rot. But these drip tips direct the water off, and you'll see these a lot in tropical plants in the tropical rainforest, prevents rotting. Snow, on the other hand, can freeze the leaves. It can be really heavy, so you'll see really narrow, thin leaves that are encased in wax. And then water loss, that wax actually does prevent water loss, and you'll see it in lots of other cactus have a waxy surface, right? This will keep the water inside. And plants have to deal with the changing seasons as well, right? They have to deal with the cold. They have to deal with all of these little thin tissues that could freeze. And so this is how you get deciduous trees. That's an example of how that's sort of the changing color of the plant, right? That's that version of that. All right, now one of the things that we will focus on mostly in class are the changing seasons, right? I'm sorry, human influence. Wow, I totally lost my train of thought there. Sorry about that. One of the things we're going to deal with in class is the human influence, right? I already gave you an example of where we introduced a really good competitor into an ecosystem it had not evolved in and was wreaking havoc. This is one of the things that we do. We take species where they weren't before. We destroy habitat, so we increase competition among native species. Our population directly competes with other species, and we are an excellent competitor. We outcompete almost everybody else, right? We pollute the environment, and we take other species in record numbers. We hunt, we fish, we collect, we harvest, we do all of those things. So we're going to focus a lot on our influence on other ecosystems, both intentional and unintentional. All right, so I know that this was a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. Please make sure you write down your questions, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.